Hello YouTube, welcome back to Brunger Builds. Today I'll be attempting to get a tempered metal effect, as well as experimenting with multi-layered paint chipping during the build of Kylo Ren's lightsaber. Alright, for starters, this is a free file I found on Thingiverse. I will link it as well as all the other materials I used down in the description below. I started off the build using my trusty wood filler to fill in the layer lines on the lightsaber stand. Aside from these two pieces, which are filament printed, all the other parts were resin printed in order to get a higher amount of detail. I'm still getting the hang of resin printing, and so I feel like a lot of my pieces need a bit more cleanup than they should. In order to do that, I use a combination of sandpaper and this 2-inch chisel. When used gently and with even pressure, the chisel makes cleaning up supports as well as flattening rough spots extremely easy. Resin tends to be fairly brittle, and that actually works in your favor in this instance. Aside from needing to clean up my parts maybe a little too much, all the prep work you're seeing me do here is fairly standard for any sort of resin printing, so I'll just quickly move on to the unique bits. I was a bit sloppy with the positioning of my drainage holes, and so I needed to fill some of them. For that, I just used some wood filler, and later used a bunch of filler primer to really smooth out the surface. I printed the version of this hilt with no wires, and so I needed to go through and drill my own holes for real wire that I would be adding later. In order to be sure that none of the parts would crack during my drilling, I first started with a very tiny pilot hole, and then worked my way up to the size I would need for the wire. After the holes were drilled, I glued in the side emitters. And thankfully I realized fairly quickly that I glued them in upside down, and was able to remove them just before the glue completely set. This could have been really bad because that Starbond superglue has a very strong hold. When I'm trying to mimic a scratched up metal part, I've found that it's best to add these scratches before painting begins. This is because when a real metal piece is scratched, the scratches reveal more metal. If I were to add my scratches after painting these pieces, the scratches would reveal resin. And so doing these scratches beforehand ensures that even after all your other weathering with washes and chalks and things like that, you'll always have a base layer of metal in the scratches, which again mimics the look of a real metal piece that has been scratched. And because most of these pieces will all be some shade of metal color, they first get a coat of semi-gloss black. This black base coat helps to add reflectivity to your top layer of metal color. I felt like there was a bit too much blank space on the left side of the exposed internals, and so to add a bit of detail, I used a couple of cut-off turrets from my Hoth diorama a few weeks ago. Looking back on this footage, I wish I had added just a little bit more detail right above where the wire goes into the exposed internals, since I feel like there's still a little too much blank space. This little belt clip is the only piece on the hilt that is brass colored, and so I dry brushed it with Rub 'n Buff's antique gold color. And once that had dried, I painted the little Allen bolts with a darker metal color. I ended up having to repaint these exposed internals at a later step, but initially I painted and masked them, thinking that potentially the copper color would affect the color later on. Spoiler alert, it didn't, and so I could have waited to paint these until much later down the line. Again, this step was completely unnecessary, but the technique still works really great. All it is using a thick coat of kids' craft glue, and then once that dries, you can paint over it as many times as you'd like, and everything underneath your glue will remain clean and paint-free. I dry brushed the lightsaber stand's little arms with Vallejo's chrome metal color. I felt like using a bright metal color would help add to a bit more of the clean aesthetic of the First Order. I actually first used this lightsaber stand in my Cal Kestis lightsaber build, since it's modeled from that game, but I actually really like the look of it, and so I plan to use it for all my lightsaber builds in the future. I felt like it was only natural to paint the base dark red, since red is the favorite color of all Star Wars bad guys.
It is only natural.
Okay, now we're talking about painting the body of the hilt. Once the black base had dried, I went over the entirety of the hilt using Vallejo's Duraluminum. This required multiple light coats to really get the color right, and so I encourage you to take your time and be patient. Once all these pieces had dried, I did my final glue up and then clear coated them all together with a satin clear coat. And once the clear coat had dried, I began liquid masking using the glue technique from earlier. I was vaguely going off of a few reference photos, but mostly just kind of placing the glue wherever I felt like it should be. I knew I needed the emitters to be entirely exposed silver, and so I made sure to paint them completely with the glue. I used a crumpled up ball of thick paper to apply the glue over the rest of the hilt in little spots. The creases in the paper help the glue lay down in more organic, scratchy shapes. The glue worked really well on the emitters, but if I were to do this again, I would probably use Vallejo's chipping medium or hairspray, which is a cheaper alternative. I found that once the glue had dried, in all the areas that I hadn't laid down the glue super thick, I couldn't really see it after the second coat of paint. And on top of that, removing it was a bit harder than I would have liked, and as you'll see in a minute, required lots of scraping. Hairspray or Vallejo's chipping medium, on the other hand, would have come off super easy with a little bit of water. After the glue had dried, I went over everything with Vallejo's copper color. I'm pretty sure the original prop is actually bronze coated, but I figured this would be close enough. This also required multiple coats in order to get the color right, since the base coat of duraluminum was such a bright tone. Here you can kind of see what I was talking about earlier. Luckily, I took a few pictures before paint, so I knew where the glue was. But when it came to scraping it, it took way more effort than I would have liked, and there were a few spots where my scraping wore away paint that I didn't want removed. And so, like I said, if I were to do this again, I would use a chipping medium or maybe hairspray so that the removal of this copper color would be much easier. Here you can see that the glue masking on the emitters worked really well, but because I didn't mask the ends of the emitters, I ended up needing to repaint them. Once the emitters had dried, I began attempting my tempered metal effect. Before starting this process, I watched a few other creators on YouTube who used a similar technique to get the same effect on their smaller models. But because I was doing a full-size prop, I wasn't so sure that I could get this to look quite right. To get this effect, I'm using Vallejo's Game Ink line, using their sepia, violet, and blue, starting with sepia and slowly working my way outwards from purple to blue and blending the colors in between. In my initial sepia layer, I painted too far towards the edges of the emitters, and so before the ink had dried, I used a wet rag to remove some of it. Again, I was kind of just figuring out this process as I went along, but what worked best for me was applying a thick, uneven line over the entire piece, and then quickly removing most of it with a dry rag, and then slowly building up that layer over and over until the color looked right. My main concern was making sure that the colors didn't look super uniform and had a bit more of a natural gradient. In this shot, you can kind of see that the gradation between all the lines of color looks a bit too symmetrical and clean. And so after taking this shot, I actually went back and blended a bit more. Once the ink had dried, I clear coated everything and waited for that clear coat to dry. And having learned my lesson with the glue from the first layer, I switched to using Vallejo's chipping medium and gave the entire thing a coat of that before moving on to the black. I was getting pretty excited at this point since the whole thing looked really nice in this matte black color. Once I had let the paint dry for about 20 to 30 minutes, I began chipping. This was only my second time using Vallejo's chipping medium, my first time being my Commander Bly build from last week. In that build, I learned I needed to be a lot more delicate with the application of water and the chipping of the paint. And so I made sure to apply the water in much smaller batches and chip with a much lighter hand. Like I said in my last video, I'm trying to get better at being more refined with my weathering, and I definitely feel like I still went a bit overboard in this step. And so to compensate for that and to knock back some of the brightness of the exposed metal, later down the line, I went a bit heavier and darker with my acrylic wash. Overall though, I was really happy with the way the chipping medium responded in this build as compared to my last build. Here you can see that the glue masking method worked a little too well, and it actually took quite a bit of scraping in the corners to get all of it out. To add a bit more visual interest, I dabbed on a darker metal color to all the bolt heads, and then painted the little wire clips with a bright silver. I didn't have any small blue wire or thick red wire, so I painted my own. Once the wires had dried, I installed them into the pre-drilled holes. It was kind of a hassle getting the thick red wire through the little clips. Everything fit just fine before paint, but after the multiple layers of paint, there was definitely some scraping needed before the wire would slide nicely through the clips. Here you can see I experienced a little bit of shrinkage with my wood filler, but fortunately the little red end cap covered most of it. I say this in all my videos, but don't be afraid to use the cheapest possible acrylics for your washes. I like to mix my black and brown until I get a nice old motor oil color. And then the final step in my weathering process, which is my favorite, is using pastel chalks. For this build, I went a little lighter with my chalk. Instead of scraping it into clumps in the nooks and crannies, I kind of just brushed a combination of black and brown and green into the recesses. Once the matte Mod Podge and IPA dries, it leaves behind a nice chalky texture that's really subtle, but can be built up to be really rough if you want. I painted a greenish brown chalk into the crevices of the hilt and then dabbed it away from all the high points. And then, like I said earlier, to knock back some of the brightness of the metal, I went really heavy with a black layer. Once this chalk layer had dried completely, I went over everything with a matte clear coat. And then this baby was ready for its glamour shots. If you made it this far into the video, thank you very much for watching. There's a few things on this build that I wish I could tweak, but overall, I'm really happy with the result. And I'm proud that I can add a few more prop building techniques to my belt. If you'd like to see more from me, make sure to subscribe, since I plan to drop a new video every Saturday. I'd like to also say a big thank you to the over 700 people who have already subscribed to this channel. This whole process of learning as I go has been very challenging, but very rewarding, and I'm excited to see what this channel becomes in the future. Thanks again, everybody, for watching. Have a good day.